Hello, everybody. Good morning, and welcome to another episode of Evan's News, this more daily audio podcast type beat. Maybe I should put the microphone a little bit closer to my face. So we have a lot to talk about today, and I'm gonna try and get into it relatively quickly because I think there's a lot that I want to get into, and I want to keep these podcast episodes or these Evans News episodes, excuse me, under an hour or an hour max because I do not have time, in all transparency, to have a podcast episode that is longer than 1 hour. Keep calling this a podcast because it's just my voice with some video game Resident Evil 4 playing some gameplay in the background. That's what's going to happen again today. I wonder, is it better for the microphone to be this close to me or farther away? Trying that. Trying that. Sorry if this is a little too loud for you guys. I'll maybe adjust it in editing. We'll see what happens. Gonna try and edit a little bit more. But yeah, today there's gonna be some, again, background gameplay like there was in the last video. But this time I have some images, some data that I want to put up. So we're gonna try it. We're gonna see how it goes. Hopefully eventually I can just show my face. I think that would be the best type of way, but it's just my lighting's so bad that just be horrible. It would just be horrible for you guys, and I don't want to do that to you. So yeah, that out of the way, I've tried a couple more things. This time, believe it or not, I actually have some notes on what I want to talk about. I was re-listening to the episode yesterday, and there was a lot of ums and pauses, these just minutes long pauses. Ideally, I should edit those out, but I do want to have this to you guys before the evening since I'm waking up early, so most of this news is, from yesterday. Um, so I feel like if I post this at night, you're getting outdated news at that point, and I don't want to do that to you. So it's still going to be relatively unedited. So I know I just said but there will be some pauses, some some ahs, all that kind of fun stuff. I'm hoping that my notes cut that down a decent amount. But yes, let's get into it. It is about 6:30 in the morning, and I have been up for a little bit. Recorded some gameplay for the background. That's what I did as I ate my breakfast, have my cup of coffee, ready to talk about the news. Before we get into that, though, I want to add to something from yesterday's episode. Yesterday, we talked about the Save America Act and voter suppression, and you know, the point of what I was trying to say in my more unfiltered thoughts, and this is another reason why I am taking notes and hopefully giving you guys a more directed point to what I am saying, was that I don't like it. I think making voting harder across the board is a bad thing. And I talked about America's kind of voter participation rate, amongst eligible voters. I think those were just eligible voters and not registered voters. I do think it was just eligible voters. My point still stands, even if it is for eligible voters, because that means either a lot of eligible voters are not registered to vote or that they are registered to vote and don't vote. So either way, my point still stands. Um, I think in my point about low voter participation rate, I focused a little bit too much on, people not voting because they don't care about politics or because they may not like both parties. That is a thing. Um and it is an issue especially here where there are a lot of people who do not care about politics. I mean, to be fair, most of the people that I know do care about politics and get involved and go out and vote every single election, right? That is a lot of people that I know around my age group. But if I talk to, around my parents' generation or people that are just older in general, it to me maybe this is a purely kind of how do I say it? This is purely anecdotal from my experiences alone, are that there were a decent amount of people who just didn't care as much about politics. They kind of didn't pay attention as much. They might have voted for the president or whatever, but politics and keeping up on the news was not something that they really went out of their way to do, right? Um, that's what I've noticed a lot about maybe like Gen X, even the boomers a little bit, is that they did not participate as much in the political system. It seems like younger generations, especially millennials, Gen Z, all that kind of stuff, do participate a lot more in politics. I think social media is a big part of that. Um, but yeah, especially amongst older generations, I think there was a sort of political apathy that was much more prevalent at the time. Um, and I think that comes to that they could ignore politics, especially white folks, um, pretty much only white folks. But that the 90s, 2000s, the 80s too were kind of times when, like feel good times. The 2000s really weren't, but I do think there was still some of that kind of idea beyond 9/11. Um, and yeah, I think I focus a little bit too much on that reason, though. I do think it is still an issue. No matter what, people should pay attention to politics. I know I'm really annoying, but I think keeping up on the news, keeping yourself informed, is one of your duties as an informed citizen and as a participant in the democratic process. That being said, um, I don't think I emphasize some more structural issues for folks to go out and vote. I think I focus a little bit too much on personal. I would say personal failings, stuff like not paying attention to politics because you don't want to. Um, I think I focus a little bit too much on that. And like I said, I do think that's an issue. It is not the only issue, and I think it's not the like main reason why we see low voter participation. And I want to emphasize a little bit more on more structural issues before we get into the news today. Some of the more structural issues are stuff like, you know, the fact that in a lot of places, these are neighborhoods, usually predominantly that are um, where predominantly minorities live in. Um, there may only be one polling booth for a large group of people, where yes, you can go vote, right? But it is going to take a really long time to vote. You will need to go to the polling booth and usually wait in a really, really long line. So yeah, this is one where people of this is usually in neighborhoods where a lot of people of color live. Um, it is very famously a way of disenfranchising those people because it is a way to kind of essentially just make it harder to vote. Like I was saying with the yesterday with these um, voter ID laws, how it makes it harder to vote and thus making less people vote. If you make voting a massive inconvenience, less people are going to vote. And one of the big reasons is that in this country, voting is not like a paid holiday. I know that you get, in certain areas, you do get X amount of paid hours for going to vote, I believe. But it's not a holiday. Not everybody gets the day off, which if you are voting, you should have the day off. That way you can set aside the whole day to go vote. Um, but instead, it's just kind of seen as a thing that you might do on your way to work or maybe on your lunch break or something. Um, it is not a paid holiday, and I think that that's a really important thing. Um, I think that it is something that should be done. It should be a paid holiday to go vote. But one of the reasons why having one polling booth for so many people, beyond just the inconvenience of waiting in a long line, is that you need to essentially take a lot of time off of work to go vote. And that might be time that you are not paid for. So there is not only the inconvenience of a long waiting time, there is the economic cost of those long waiting times. That making it so inconvenient means that you lose money for going to vote, meaning that you're essentially spending money to go vote because you are losing off on wages. You are losing off on money you could have earned if you had gone to work. Maybe you take a sick day, maybe you take a vacation day, but those are still personal times that you need to go and use to vote. I don't think I emphasize those points enough. I think I made it a little bit more of a personal failing on a lot of people. Um, but there are a lot of structural barriers to voting, especially for people of color. Um, Especially for folks that live like the government or people in charge of these polling stations, you know, may make it very hard to go out and vote. And that is one of the structural issues that stop people from voting in this country. And I did not emphasize that enough. So I just wanted to add that from yesterday's episode. I think it's really important to know that while, yes, I still think it is an issue, political apathy is an issue in this country. I think that emphasizing the more structural issues is very important as well, and something that I didn't emphasize as much yesterday. So just wanted to add that. Awesome. With that, let's get into the actual news stories I want to talk about today. I realize I spent way more time clarifying that than I wanted to, but that's okay. I think it was important. So let's talk about something. So there is a big security conference in Munich, the Munich Security Conference. Um, and big thing on the table is the relationship between the US and Europe. I'm sure you all remember, as it was not that long ago, when Trump basically threatened to militarily take over Greenland, which is a Danish territory. Greenland is a territory of Denmark. Um, I know that there's a big independence movement in Greenland, but just because there's an independence movement in Greenland does not mean they want to be a part of the US. It might mean they want to be, independent. Anyway, beyond that, which doesn't really matter for the conversation around whether or not the US should take over Greenland, um, this really put a strain on the transatlantic alliance, quote unquote. If you don't know what the transatlantic alliance is, that's the security relationship, stuff like NATO between the US, Canada, and most of Western Europe. A lot of European countries are a part of NATO. I will put up a map of NATO on the screen right now. So that's what the transatlantic alliance refers to, is the alliance between essentially the United States and Western Europe that was established during the Cold War. Um, and as I've talked about kind of a lot, I know I always talk about this, but the threat to annex Greenland, in my opinion, has changed just the rules-based world order, right? I think there's just no question about that. That the US threatening to militarily attack an ally is maybe not right now, right? Because the US is still the largest military by a long shot, and Europe does not spend a lot of money on defense. I don't think it's going to be as obvious immediately, but in the long run, the US's role in the world, the US's role as world leader, the US's role as leader of this sort of Western alliance is going to diminish. That's my opinion. I think that us threatening Greenland was the nail in the coffin for that. And in the future, this world space world order, it's just over. I think it's over. But, in the short term, it might not seem like that. In the long run, I think that's what's going to happen. So that's what happened recently. We threatened to invade Greenland, and in my opinion, this is going to change everything in the future. I think it's just the beginning of a new chapter. But Right now, there is a security conference going on where Marco Rubio is going to represent the United States. Um, Last year, it was JD Vance, which was disastrous. JD Vance, of course, has no political aptitude, in my opinion. Um, Most of Trump's cabinet are all fascists, right? They probably agree with nearly everything that JD Vance has to say. The problem with JD Vance, from their perspective, is that JD Vance is just not a good politician. He is, he's too abrasive. He's just not a good politician. He doesn't know how to talk to people. Every time he talks, it's a disaster, right? He's uncharismatic. He's not good at, you know, appealing to people or anything like that. JD Vance is just a disaster on every single front, right? So this year they're sending Marco Rubio. And I do think that Marco Rubio is still kind of an old school neoconservative at heart. I think that he does not like the fact that we are basically destroying our alliance system right now. I don't think he likes that. I think, however, he's spineless and will just go along with whatever Trump has to say. Um, and I think that is what is about to keep on keeping on right now, where he will emphasize the fact that the US wants to pull out, I will say, of the Western alliance system or have a much less role in it. But he's going to do that in a way that's not quite as abrasive. And he's gonna basically smooth over that, I think, a little bit better than JD Vance will. Um, and yeah, so Marco Rubio is going to Munich, and he's going to give a big speech on Saturday where, we're really going to see what the Trump administration's plans for the future when it comes to our relationship with Europe will be. Um, he's already said that this is, by the way, I'm getting all this information from the BBC, so I want to make it clear where I'm getting my sources from. Where he's saying that we're entering a new era of global politics and that the US and our allies need to re examine our role within the world. And, this is kind of obvious. This is kind of obvious. And a lot of people are saying that the US and the Trump administration's policies, especially, are bringing an end to that international rules based order. One where everybody follows a set of rules, though it's not always been followed. Obviously, the US has had a lot of privileges in that world order, but it is one where the US is kind of doing its own thing, right? We are not really participating with our allies anymore. We're basically saying that we don't need our allies as we pull in our resources to kind of focus on the imperialism that Trump wants to do. I think people often make a mistake and say that Trump is an isolationist. Trump is not an isolationist. Trump still wants to be involved in the world, right? Trump still thinks the US has a place in the world, one where we're, a strong military presence, but one where our sphere of influence is kind of the Americas. And in my opinion, I want to make it clear. I am not an expert on international relations. I am not an expert on anything that I am talking about right now. I'm just a guy who has opinions and is sharing those opinions with the few people that will listen to them. Um, but I do own all of my opinions. So anyone that thinks my opinions are dumb should let me know. I own all of my opinions. So if I say something wrong or stupid, call me out for it. But like I was saying, I am not an expert on international relations at all. So, you should defer your information sometimes to someone with a little bit more expertise. But in my opinion, Trump is kind of changing his his strategy for the international world order, and the US's place within it as an understanding that the US cannot continue to be the world leader indefinitely. You know what I mean? To be the sole superpower, to be the kind of world police. I think that Trump is accepting that fact and is making a world where the United States' sphere of influence is the Americas, and we're kind of deferring our role as leader within the rest of the world to other powers. In Trump's case, those powers are Russia and China, but there is a sort of, I think, in the Trump administration's foreign policy, an understanding that the United States can no longer be the world leader. It cannot do so indefinitely. And I do think this is true to a certain extent. I do think that the United States, right? I'm not commenting on the morality of a superpower or the morality of a hegemon. What I am saying, simply put, is that it is really, really expensive to be a hegemon. Um, it is easier to be a hegemon when you control a lot of the world's wealth. And after World War II, the US did control a lot of the world's wealth. I think it was around the United States had like 50% of the world's economic output following World War II. That's right, half of the world's like GDP, half of the world's wealth essentially belonged or was outputted by the United States. We were by far the wealthiest country and we were by far the most productive country on the planet. And when you're in that position and kind of everyone else has been destroyed by World War II, it is essentially a lot easier to be a hegemon. Um, and our percentage as a share of wealth in the world was always relatively high, right? Maybe not always 50%, but always relatively high. But in recent decades, other countries have become wealthier. So the United States' share of the world's wealth has decreased over time. And because of that, because other countries can now spend more on their militaries, they can spend more on their own kind of, setting up relations, setting up their own like spheres of influence, whatever that might be. The United States needs to spend more to counteract that as other countries have the ability to spend more. So even without the Trump administration, right? Even without everything going on right now, in my opinion, we still would not be the world hegemon forever. Simply put, it was going to end no matter what. And I mean, this is just like the reality of the world. This is ignoring the fact that the United States has kind of turned its back on its own population. Um, so the population, they don't have health care. There's a lot of stuff that the United States could provide for its citizens that it refuses to. Um, there's the fact of the debt crisis. There's a lot of issues within the United States that, even without Trump is going to kind of exasperate and kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Get the ball rolling maybe a little bit on the United States losing its position as global hegemon, um, even without the Trump administration. And in my opinion, the Trump administration's kind of I think there is kind of a recognition of that fact. And well, hey, perhaps what they are doing is kind of carving out a space in that quote unquote new world order, one where the United States is not the global hegemon, one where it's more multipolar, meaning there's other world powers that can challenge the United States. And they're kind of going back to, a late 19th century, or just 19th century in general, early 20th century kind of imperialist doctrine where our sphere of influence is the Americas. going back on the Monroe Doctrine. Not that we ever turned our back on the Monroe Doctrine. We have been interfering in American politics, and by American now I'm referring to all of the Americas, especially South and Central America, for years. Even after World War II, I mean, you guys know the bit of CIA coups and all that kind of stuff. The Monroe Doctrine has been alive and well for years, but I think what Trump is doing is a more explicit kind of pullback to the Americas being the United States sphere of influence, while the rest of the world is divided amongst the other powers. I do think that's kind of my interpretation of what the Trump administration is doing. Again, I'm not an expert. Please, defer expertise to other people, but that's my opinion. And I own that opinion again. So, when we threatened to invade Greenland, I think that was kind of um, what's the word I'm looking for? A natural growth of that ideology, where the Americas are the United States sphere of influence. So we need Greenland for security purposes. Um, Issue is that doesn't make much sense because if we just kept our alliance with NATO, we would have had troops in Greenland anyway because Denmark didn't really care if we had troops there. We already had troops there. It was, part of the NATO alliance. So there was a lot of military cooperation there anyway. But that's what I think is going on in the Trump administration's head. I think it is dumb. I think it is a bad way of going about politics in the future. I think it's going to make a much more dangerous world in the future as um, we're carving up these spheres of influence, and you know you have all these countries that are now going to be more enemies and stuff that have nukes. I think this is I think it's going to be bad in the future. I think it's going to make a much more dangerous world. um I think that's kind of what the United States is thinking, though. And that is what is going on when we threaten to invade Greenland. And I think, at least I hope, that Europe recognizes that and is going to put more of an effort and more money into its own defense. I think that's what's going to happen because, simply put, I mean, this was months ago at this point, but most NATO countries agreed to spend 5% of their GDP on defense spending. 5%. 5% is a lot. 5% is not a small amount. So, what it means by when we spend 5% of our GDP on defense, I'm not saying we do not spend 5% of our GDP on defense, but when a country spends 5% of their GDP on defense, it means just that you spend 5% of your GDP. So if your GDP is like $100 billion, you spend $5 billion on defense. Um, and 5% is a decent amount. That's a lot of money. Um, I will again put this data on the screen so that way you can look at it. But for instance, the United States, the largest spender on the military in the world, right? To be fair, we have a massive economy. So, percentage wise, it is not as much. We spend 3.31% of our GDP on defense. So, what that means is that we have a military all over the world. We have tons of ships. We have like really expensive technology because of how much money we spend, but we still only, quote unquote, spend 3.31% of our GDP on the military. Um, Russia, which is, fighting a war in Ukraine, spends 4.61% of its GDP. Ukraine is spending, about a quarter, but um, 5% is a lot. And I think it is a recognition by Europe that the United States is pulling out and that they need to spend more money on defense. I mean, even Macron is saying that that Europe must prepare for independence from the US. And I think our threatening to invade Greenland is the final nail in that coffin. They're like, we cannot trust the United States for defense. Marco Rubio did say that the US will not abandon Europe, but that Europe needs to spend more on its own defense. Um, and I think what he means by that is that the Trump administration does have plans to essentially take itself out of Europe. Maybe not abandon it completely, but I do think they still think they will. Give me 1 second. I'm going to pause my recording as I do something really quick. So sorry about that, everybody. But yeah, I do think this is essentially the end of the United States' role as global hegemon. Um, I think the world order has changed forever. Us threatening to invade Greenland was us turning our back on our allies. And I hope that Europe wakes up to that. I hope that it wakes up to that sooner than later. Again, I don't think we're going to see the consequences of this for years to come because Europe needs to rebuild its military. For years, for decades, they have relied on the United States for defense. Um, so, the US has had a huge military presence in Europe. But I can see, in the coming years, coming decade or so, the US pulling out of Europe as Europe spends a lot more on defense and the US's role within the Western alliance, if there even is any sort of Western alliance, by the way, diminishing over time. Trump won't be in office forever. This administration will eventually leave. They are not going to be here forever. But the consequences of this, I think, will be forever. I think the consequences of us invading Greenland will be forever. Like I said, Macron has said Europe must prepare for independence from the US, and the Netherlands is again increasing its defense spending to 5% of their GDP. That is a lot of money, and it is going to take sacrifices on Europe. I mean, that's what the Netherlands said, that they are making significant sacrifices to reach that 5%. Um, this is not going to be easy for Europe. I mean, we all give praise to Europe's social safety net, right? A lot of European countries have free healthcare. They have a lot of social safety nets for their citizens, and their citizens are all highly taxed. But the US's defense of Europe does, to a certain extent, subsidize these social programs. And either there might be cuts in these social programs as Europe spends more on its money, or people are going to be taxed more. Um, I hope the people of Europe accept higher taxes. I'd love for them to keep their social safety net. I want some of that social safety net. Like, I hope we get that here one day. Um, but we will see. And that's another point that I want to make is that as the US pulls out, you know, and as maybe after the Trump administration, we take a lesser role in the Western alliance, we are not seen as the global leaders and instead cooperating with other countries in a more multipolar world order, that we may spend less money on our military and maybe spend some of that money on social programs. That's the more hopeful side of me. Will that happen? Probably not. Not without a significant amount of fighting on our part. But yeah, that's what I have to say on that. The world is changing, everybody, and it's going to be interesting to see on Saturday what Rubio says, which is tomorrow. Now that I think about it, so hopefully in tomorrow's episode we'll have an update on that. But I've spent a lot of time talking about this, and there's two other things I want to talk about. I want to talk about one more thing at the very least in the amount of time that we have left. But let's get right into it. All right. So, as you all know, recently there were two murders in Minneapolis by ICE agents. They shot two people, Renee Good and Alex Preddy, um, and whose murders were widely shared, and there was a lot of protests after these murders. And what ICE did was obviously a murder. There's just no getting around there. And I mean, two murders. There's just no getting around the fact that what ICE did, they were murders. And in the aftermath of what happened, there were mass protests all over the United States and in Minneapolis, especially. So I'm going to put up a picture of the mass protests, especially in Minneapolis. Also, sorry if I ever say Indianapolis. I spent a summer in Indianapolis, and for some reason, I always call Minneapolis Indianapolis, even though they are very different cities. Just want to say that beforehand. Um, there were mass protests all over the country and in Minneapolis. Minneapolis really did seize the initiative when it came to what was going on. There was what was essentially an occupation by ICE of Minneapolis. There was over 3,000 ICE agents in Minneapolis at the peak. 3,000 ICE agents that were going through Minneapolis, um, and essentially terrorizing citizens, kidnapping people. Um, People were scared to come out of their homes. Um, Immigrants, whether they be illegal or not, were scared to come out of their homes. They were hiding, but Minneapolis, I think, really seized the initiative. I think they met the moment. I really do think Minneapolis met the moment that they faced. Um, for a lot of the folks that were hiding at home, too scared to leave their home because they thought they would be kidnapped. I want to make that clear. Kidnapped by ICE agents. People in Minneapolis brought them food. They met the moment and they gave aid to their neighbors. Um, there was mass protests. Again, I'll show that, like you saw in that picture I showed a little bit earlier, throughout the city. And there were people that would follow ICE agents around. They would track ICE agents, put their location on the internet so you knew where those ICE agents were. Again, I really do think Minneapolis met the moment. And it is a little bit, this is a little bit of good news, though not perfectly good news. There'll be a little bit of a sour twang, is that it seems like ICE is pulling out of Minneapolis. They already said they were going to, I think this was last week, that they were going to take out 700 agents out of Minneapolis. That would bring the total from, 3,000 to 2,300. But they said that they're going to pull out even more agents of Minneapolis. That's what Tom Homan just said. And that the surge of ICE agents this is from Tom Homan, will end soon in Minneapolis. And, trying kind of to save face, Tom Homan is saying that basically they've done it. They've gone in and they completed their mission. Um, and now they can leave. Obviously, that's just them, trying to save face, because the real reason that they are leaving is because they failed in Minneapolis. Minneapolis was, at the end of the day, a test bed to see what they can get away with. Um, Fundamentally, what they were trying to see again was just, can we occupy a city and do the things that they were doing? Essentially going in, kidnapping immigrants without any sort of due process, deporting them. Can we get away with this? Can this state violence be accepted by the population? And when I say accepted by the population, I don't mean that they just, they like it. That when I'm saying that they accept the state violence, that the population is pro that state violence. When I say accept state violence, I mean that they essentially don't do anything. That eventually they just kind of accept it as a reality of everyday life, a rather horrific reality, but they just accept it as a reality of everyday life and move on. That did not happen. That did not happen at all. And I think that this is them accepting defeat. That does not mean they will not try it again in other cities. I know they were talking about maybe sending ICE agents into other blue cities. Again, this is only blue cities that they're doing this to because it's not about immigration enforcement. It's about state violence and crushing the opposition. Um, yeah, but instead, what happened in Minneapolis is that, like I said, Minneapolis really did meet the moment. They got out and they protested. They were following ICE agents. There was civil disobedience. Minneapolis really met the moment in their occupation. That's exactly what it was. Again, an occupation of Minneapolis. Um, and more than that, even beyond Minneapolis, the whole country kind of came out in defense. The whole country came out in protest after the murders of Renee Good and Alex Preddy. There were protests all across the country, and what ICE was doing was so brutal that even a lot of Trump supporters were turning their back on him. It they lost. They lost this battle at least. This does not mean that they're not going to try it again. This does not mean that they're not going to send ICE into other cities in a way that they did in Minneapolis. But it does mean that they lost this battle. And it was the people of Minneapolis, the people of the country, that I think really won this battle. And because again, the point of this, the point fundamentally of sending ICE agents into Minneapolis, the point of everything that was going on was to see if they can normalize this sort of state violence. Because again, when violence is normalized, it doesn't mean that the people like the violence or that the people are pro violence, but it does mean that they will sit back and kind of accept it while it happens because either they don't feel like they can do anything about it or it becomes so normalized that they just see it as a part of everyday life. Um, and that is one of the points of doing this is to go in to be as terrible as possible and to essentially get the population to accept, again, accept meaning not that they're like, okay, this is good, but to kind of essentially lay back and accept the fact that this is going to happen and this sort of immigration enforcement will be the norm going into the future. That is the point. It is to normalize state violence. And because people came out in protest, because people came out in opposition, doing stuff like not just protesting, following ICE agents and posting their locations where they were gonna, where their next immigration raid might be, giving food and supplies to people that are in hiding, scared of ICE. People came out in solidarity and did not allow this type of violence to be normalized. And this is something that's really important and something that we all need to learn is that when stuff like this is happening, it's really important to be involved. It's really important to keep yourself informed. It is really important to, you know, even if it's just posting on social media, even if it's just, going to your local protest or something, it is really important to be politically involved because the point was to normalize this, to create, I don't want to say apathy because people would still care about the violence, but just, I'm a little bit lost for words. I can't think of the right word, but to essentially just not do anything because they don't feel like they can do anything. To again, normalize this type of violence. And they failed because people came out and fought. They came out and protested. They came out and did more things than just protesting because a lot of these people who were following ICE agents were putting their lives on the line. I mean, Alex Preddy was essentially just filming an ICE agent when he was killed. Um, he just had his phone out, and then he was killed. It is important to make sure to fight against what is going on, to make sure to always keep pointing out the bad things that ICE are doing, even if it seems like, oh my gosh, like ICE keeps doing terrible things. Like this is becoming so like normal. It's kind of exhausting to keep up on it. Yeah, it is exhausting. It is extremely exhausting, but the point is to overwhelm you, and the point is to normalize it. And it is kind of important for us as citizens to, as participants in the system, to make sure to fight against that normalization. Because once the violence becomes normalized, then that's when it's just going to keep on happening. And, there's not going to be any more words of this is so unprecedented. We're already kind of seeing that. So I'm really happy to see that this is happening because I do think this is an admission of failure on the Trump administration's part, that they could not just go into Minneapolis and suppress a city, essentially. Trump has been kind of trying to do this throughout his entire term. I mean, sending the National Guard into places like DC. National Guard couldn't really do much in those cities because they don't have the power to arrest anyone. Um, but it was a scare tactic to try and get people to kind of accept state repression and accept state violence, and it failed. And you know, throughout everything going on that's so bad right now, I think that that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing. I really do. I am proud of Minneapolis. I'm proud of us as a people for really getting out there. This was a nationwide effort. There was a lot of people who really fought against what was going on. And I think that that is a breath of fresh air. And I think that is good news. And I think that with everything going on, with all the bad stuff that is happening at the moment, that is just really that is something to be happy about. That is at least something that we should give a thumbs up to. That the people were able to make the Trump administration admit defeat. The people still do have power, and it's important right now that we use that power. And maybe perhaps on a more somber note is something I did kind of want to touch on, though, a little bit that that I've been seeing some comparisons being made of, and I want to give some how do I say some attention to a specific comparison between ICE and slave catchers and what's going on right now and what has historically happened in the United States as well. So this is a little bit more of a history lesson, not as much, current events or political commentary like I normally do. Um, but I think it's a good comparison. I really do because a lot of people keep comparing ICE to like the SS, right? I don't really think that comparison is the best. I think if you're going to compare ICE to one of the branches of like the Nazi state violence apparatus, it would be the brown shirts. Hitler's kind of militia that he had that he used to essentially bully people into voting for him and to start to enforce his own state violence until eventually he didn't need them anymore, so he got rid of them. That's what I think ICE is a lot closer to. Um, and we can talk about that. I can expand on that more another time. But in the 10 minutes that I have, as I need to get this audio recording done and edited and posted for you guys, I do just kind of want to talk about this comparison between ICE and slave catchers and what is going on right now and what has gone on in the United States in the past, because I think that it is a good comparison, and I think it's important to know at the very least. Because what's going on in the United States at the moment is not new. And while the state violence, like I said, And we should be happy again that the people were able to make the Trump administration admit defeat. That is really good news. This sort of state violence is not new. People of color, people, that, minorities in general, meaning anyone that does not belong to the white majority, the white straight majority, have been victims of state violence for years. And I just want to make that clear. I want to make it clear that even after this battle, even if we get the Trump administration out, we get him impeached, the there is still so much more work to do. And please, 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 please do not make the mistake that so many people did, that when Trump gets out of office, we don't need to pay attention to politics anymore. We get a Democrat in, it's all good, it's all wonderful. No, there's still a lot more work to do after this happens, but I'm going to get into it. So, America has a very, very dark history. We all know this. Um, and it took until 1865 for slavery to be abolished. It took a constitutional amendment and, more importantly, a civil war to bring an end to slavery. Um, and there's going to be, I'm just giving some context before I start talking. In the past, there was a there was an understanding as the United States expanded and as more states were added to the Union that there needed to be a sort of how do you say it, like an equilibrium of free and slave states. The reason for that being was that, the House of Representatives is based on population, but the Senate is each state gets an equal amount of representation. So if there's an equal amount of free and slave states in the Senate, there will always be an equal number of representatives from free and slave states. So any fundamental change to the institution of slavery, stuff like slavery being abolished, for instance, would be able it wouldn't happen. Essentially, that was this idea of making sure that there was an equal number. It was kind of a compromise, and it was just essentially a way of making sure slavery survived, but also like getting new states into the union. It was the only way for Congress to agree to allow more states into the union if for every slave state there was a free state. So in 1850, as California is being admitted to the Union as a free state, there is the Compromise of 1850. Important thing is this is a little over 10 years before the Civil War is going to begin. So this is like really in the years leading up to the Civil War. These are years that are going to be bad in general. They're leading up to the Civil War. And the Compromise of 1850, has a couple provisions in it. California can be entered into the United States as a free state. The borders of Texas were, kind of redrawn. There was a ban of the slave trade in D.C. Not an end of slavery in D.C. again, just a ban of the slave trade in D.C. So that's an important note, as well as what we're going to be talking about today, which was the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, it's important to note that if there was a slave that had run away to the north, that had escaped to the north, um, that was illegal. And if they were caught in the north, they would have to be returned back to a slave state, right? To whatever state they had run from, to whatever plantation they had run from. It was already a law that slaves had to be returned. Um, so that was already a law, but what the Fugitive Slave Act did is it basically made it so that everyone had to participate in returning fugitive slaves. For instance, all federal judicial officials had to aid in the return of runaway slaves, and it fined people, it fined marshals. So if you didn't participate, you were fined in not arresting alleged fugitive slaves. And it fined them over $1,000, and this was 1850 money, so this is like a lot of money, I think. Um, from what I was reading, that's like around $57,000 today, so it's a lot of money. Um, but that's the thing. Like, I want you to keep that in mind. It was alleged. You would be, even if you were not, you know, even if you were not a fugitive slave, even if you had been born free or had, you know, you know, or had later gained your freedom, it didn't matter. You could still be arrested just for being an alleged runaway slave. Really important to note. Keep that in mind. Um, there was also some other stuff in the Fugitive Slave Act. This it prohibited the testimony of accused runaway slaves in court, meaning that the testimony of the accused could not be entered as evidence, right? It was not seen as valid evidence. There was also some other stuff in it where that commissioners were paid $5 for a ruling that a person was free and $10 if the person were deemed a slave. So there was a financial incentive to rule that a person accused of being a runaway slave was um, a was essentially a runaway slave, even if they were not. There was a financial incentive to do so. And this, of course, led to an increase in sort of um, an enforcement of existing and this new fugitive slave law. Like I said, before the Fugitive Slave Act, there were it was already illegal to you already had to return fugitive slaves back to the South. That was already law. But what this act did is it really ramped up enforcement of those laws. So you would see people going in and enforcing these laws, and you would see essentially, whether free or not, a lot of black folks just being kidnapped essentially because because if you were accused, you had to be arrested, right? So what would happen was a lot of plantation owners, a lot of people who were slave owners, would go to the north in search of, a person that they thought was a runaway slave. Um, where essentially you could just accuse anybody of being a runaway slave and they had to be arrested. And this is what happened. Um, the, these these slave owners would go into the north, into free states, and force people to comply and force people to essentially stand by as they kidnapped people that, like I said, kidnapped people. And a lot of folks did, start to come to the aid of people that had been there for decades. Um, it's important to note that just because people were anti slavery did not mean they were anti racist. That's very important to note. But this fugitive slave law really exasperated tensions that were going on between the North and the South. And it led to a lot of people that were going in to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. They were surrounded. There were protesters. There were people that would go in and physically stop them from enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act. And the reason why I'm talking about this is hopefully you can see some of the connections that are going on right now, in that what's going on with ICE is similar. What's going on right now, this where federal agents go in and essentially kidnap people, whether they are actually guilty of the crime, quote unquote, you know, this is not a real crime, but the crime that they are being accused of, this is not a new thing. What's going on that the federal government, they go in and just kidnap, it's not a new thing. America has a history of this. And while obviously I know what a lot of you guys are thinking, yes, there are clear differences between what is going on now and what was going on before the Civil War, where free or not, you could just be accused of being a slave and taken either back or kidnapped into slavery. Yes, trust me, I get it. There are clear differences. But, this is not my own quote. History doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. It is important to know that this sort of state violence, this sort of state terror, is not a new thing. It is not a new thing. And that's why it's so important to keep yourself informed, to keep yourself participating in politics, because, simply put, you have to continue this fight to make sure it doesn't happen again. We always need to try and fight against state violence, to try and fight against things like this that are going on. And also, even when it's not as explicit, to keep on fighting the fight, even after Trump is gone. With that, everybody, my hour is about up. And I wish you all a wonderful day. I will be posting again tomorrow morning, which is Valentine's Day. So, love is in the air. But with that, this is Evans News, signing off.